Hey there's the Economancer. Long time no talk. I'm back with another introduction into some corruption and looking at some books in corruption. So, today and for the next few videos, I know it's been a while, but I'm back. We're going to be going into a book by Brian Klaas, Corruptible. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that corruption is something that I care deeply about, something I've studied in multiple different genres and multiple different ways. And so I found this book interesting. One, because the table of contents sets up kind of clear, but also corruptible. Who gets power and how it changes us? Well, that's a bold statement to make, to say that corruption changes us. But if you believe in evolution pretty seriously, it matter of fact would, right? So to give the pacing of this book, we're going to look at the acknowledgement, right? So typically acknowledgements is I acknowledge someone in my life, thank you, etc., etc. This one is to all the nice non-psychopaths out there who should be in charge but aren't. That's a bold statement to make. Why? Because first, you're automatically poisoning the well, right? You're stating that those who are in power are psychopaths, which is a common trope, but there's not a whole lot of good evidence to support this. And I think later on we'll actually get into some of his evidence to support this and, look at it. But let's just start off with this first idea. So psychopaths, right? They're the ones who control everything, right? First, what is a psychopath, right? Well, we have two different types of psychopaths. Without breaking down psychopathy more in depth, you have subclinical psychopaths and clinical psychopaths, right? Subclinical comes from the dark triad. You can score in the 99th percentile of the dark triad in psychopathy and still be subclinically psychopathic. Same with narcissism. You can score in the 99th percentile of narcissism and still be considered subclinically narcissistic. And then you have Machiavellianism, right? Which is something that may be thought of as psychopathy or sociopathy, but it's actually not. And it doesn't even have a clinical designation. It's just someone at your work who tries to scheme a lot, right? But that doesn't mean that they're a psychopath or that they're evil or any of these things. They're just trying to, within their own moral foundation, enact change as they see fit. And it's very utilitarian. And it's not something that we should consider as evil and that these people are bad when we think of someone being high in Machiavellianism, or high in subclinical psychopathy or high in subclinical narcissism, right? These are just manifestations of individuals' personality dispositions that are modified slightly by these subclinical directories. All right, so the table of contents. Today we're going to be going over the introduction, but the next one will be the evolution of power. Then we have moths to a flame, the power delusion, petty tyrants and psychopaths, bad systems or bad people, why it appears that power corrupts, how power changes your body. I mean, if you lift heavy, you're going to get bigger, right? Attracting the incorruptible, the weight of responsibility, waiting for the Cincinnatus. All right, so jumping into the introduction, we're going to go into the first paragraph and then break it down and then go through the rest. All right, does power corrupt or are people drawn to power? That's a question. That's probably one of the most fundamental questions in corruption studies, right? Even if we remove all of the economic theories, the sociological theories and everything, just the basic premise is, does power corrupt? Does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. Or people who are drawn to power, they're corrupt, and when they get in the power, they act it out or manifest it, right? Are entrepreneurs who embezzle and cops who kill the outgrowths of bad systems, or are they just bad people? I think that's poorly worded, but who am I? Are tyrants made or born, or both? That's my addition. If you were thrust into a position of power, would new temptations to line your pockets or torture your enemies gnaw away at you until you gave in? somewhat unexpectedly, we can start to find an answer to those questions on two forgotten faraway islands. Man. So if you were thrust into a position of power, how would you act? That there's a lot that's got to be unpacked in there. And again, I look forward to this book unpacking a lot of this because that is a fundamental question, right? Now, are entrepreneurs who embezzle and cops who kill the outgrowths of bad systems, or are they bad people? That's a weird thing. I don't know why you would say cops who kill the outgrowths of bad systems, or are they just bad people? So the bad system, I guess, would be the poverty or the lack of collective efficacy in inner cities. And then the cops kill the outgrowths of that bad system. Would they be outgrowths? How would they be? How would you define them to be the outgrowth of the system? Because they're growing out of it, or are they growing in it? And this is just poor phraseology, in my opinion, that, we really need to, when we say systems, we really need to just understand what we mean, draw differentiations, draw distinctions, lay it out, label it, and set it up for inspection and analysis. This doesn't do it, but regardless. All right, so how would you act? Well, so the first analogy that he gives is off the western coast of Australia. There is a ship called the Batavia that sets sail from the Netherlands, right? So obviously European hierarchical structure. It has a captain and a skipper, the second in command. Well, the ship crashes, starts to go down. Everybody runs away, gets off the ship. Some people die. The captain and some of the crew go out and say, we're going to go get help. And so they sail off to go get help. And then the skipper stays in power at the landing spot, right? So they go to an island. And he's a corrupt, tyrannical leader killing people, right? People who are going to threaten his power, people who aren't doing what they're told. And he's like controlling the economy and all of these things, right? And then the second is looking at 4,000 miles off the Beacon Island of Australia lies another deserted island, the Tongan Archipelago. So a strong storm tossed around a 24-foot boat, ripping away the anchor and then pushing them adrift. Through the ocean currents, they land on an island. As the 6 teenagers began to lose hope, they spotted a looming splash of green in the distance. These 6 individuals worked together, and they didn't have any infighting. In fact, they had great division of labor. They kept a fire going. They managed to take care of one of the individuals when they got hurt. And so the extrapolation from this is looking at like this hierarchical structure that comes from the Western European or the European society versus the Tongan society, and saying, hey, in this Polynesian society, they have flatter hierarchies, which is why when they landed on this island, their flatter hierarchy worked better and they cooperated. They didn't need tyranny and all of this stuff to manifest it. Here's the rebuttal to that, right? So first of all, this is comparing apples to oranges. The skipper that had that power given to them, right? First, they cannot enact this power by themselves. That's why it's called power, because power is energies that enter into like a singular person or a body of persons. And so that means you have to have people that elect or give power to this individual. So this person, right? So let's say it's this one individual and 99 other people. He cannot control those 99 other people, because the moment that they stand up and go, no, you're not going to kill my cousin because you're a jerk, and I'm going to get the 99 people to beat you to death, that ends that hierarchical structure very quickly. So there has to be somebody empowering that individual in power. Now, you can have a minority rule over a majority through fear and other sources of technological differentiation. That makes sense. But you can't just have one person just do that. that's not reasonable, right? And because there's a larger number of people, there's a more complex system being engaged versus the six, where if you're the six, then you've got to have like a 3-2 kind of thing. And then you're hoping under those 3-2 conditions that you can win the fight and that you're not so hurt from the fight in those conditions that you can't take care of yourself after the fact. Plus you need the six people so that you can have this division of labor. So the hierarchy doesn't need to be, because we can all come to agreements with six people. It's a lot easier than it is with 100. So again, we're comparing apples to oranges. And that doesn't tell us anything about those people who come into corruption. It doesn't tell us anything about the hierarchy of the structure. It doesn't tell us anything about why these different cultures would have this belief. All it does is compare two very distinctly different types of environments and structures against each other. But there's nothing to be gained from that analysis. And it's a poor use of analogy in this. All right, so we move into this next part. All right, so these are the book answers 4 main questions. Now, we'll see if they answer them. But here we go. First, do worse people get power? Well, you gotta break that down. What does worse mean? What does power mean? Yeah. Second, does power make people worse? Again, what defines as worse? That seems subjective, right? So this worse statement is subjective. And then what does power mean doesn't really get answered yet. It just says that it's the top of the hierarchy thus far that we've kind of looked at. But that's not exactly what power is. Power isn't just being at the top of the hierarchy. There's more to it than that. Third, why do we let people control us who clearly have no business being in control? Again, this is subjective. Why do you say, or why would we think that they have no business being in control? Is it because of our subjective value judgments that we pass on to this person? Does that mean that they ought not be in power? I don't know. I think that's a loaded question. And it's hard for me to think that can be answered directly. Fourth, how can we ensure that incorruptible people get to power and wield it justly? That's 2 questions. How can we ensure incorruptible people get into power? And how can we ensure that incorruptible people who are in power wield it justly? Which is basically reframing the second question is, does power make people worse? Right? But again, if we look at the beginning of the statement, is how can we ensure that incorruptible people get into power? So if we assume that they've gotten into power, then we would assume they're incorruptible. Then we would assume that they would wield that power justly by the notion of them being incorruptible, which no one's incorruptible. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't exist. Everyone's corruptible and everyone is corrupt. That's a biblical statement more than it is anything, but I think it's a statement of human nature. We're all fallen creatures and we're all continue down paths of doing corrupt and bad things. No matter what your own personal belief is, you will fail to live up to the idea of what your own personal belief is. So by that definition, you are corrupt. All right. The next part he goes into where he has a conversation with a former war leader, lord of daughter. Now, this gets a little bit strange. So the first part, he's going to explain all of the deeds of this leader, how this person was corrupt. And then he's going to go interview the daughter. And he's going to be like, well, under these assumptions, were you corrupt? Or would you be corrupt? And basically the daughter goes, yeah. One, I think my father was truly in power after he was deposed from power. I think he should still be, and our family line should still be in power, right? And so this raises the question on what is this power or this hierarchy seeking behavior, right? Is it genetic or is it environment? Well, you can infer both from this, that it is both genetic and it is both environmental. Because let's say if you have a genetic predisposition towards something, the environment may be the thing that hits that switch and turns it on, and that makes you manifest that behavior. Whereas if you didn't have that environmental structure, you wouldn't have manifested that behavior. And so that's something to think about in all of these equations that we're going to be looking at when it comes to power. Because you very well may have the general predisposition towards this highly authoritative, highly tyrannical, corruption. But that doesn't mean it would manifest just because you got that power, because there might be something prior to that that had to happen for you to manifest it. But we don't know what those are. We don't know what the genetic material for someone to be corrupt is, because again, it's subjective, first of all, and then second of all, what environment would lead you to that? There are people that come from environments of complete and utter destitution and terrible lives that, in church are considered saints because, they fought against this. They didn't let that behavior manifest because they acted against this nature. So how do we answer that given the prior questions? Because you can act against it. Even if you have that genetic predisposition, even if you are in the environment that does trigger it, you can still manifest something against it. It just isn't perfect, right? But I think most of us could agree if we got into power, we probably wouldn't, exterminate our political opposition or something like that. I would hope most people don't agree with that. I may be speaking too soon. I have no idea. But I think that would be, the way to think about it. Okay, so really what this goes into next is Zimbardo's weird prison study that I'm sure everyone who's had Psychology 101 has had to look at and go, wow, I can't believe this. Well, he lays out the implications for the study is that, when people are put into positions of power, they will embody that power and be corrupted by it, which is what Zimbardo's ultimate end of his study said. But there was some serious problems with that study that have been pointed out numerous times that doesn't get shoved as much into the textbooks that I'm aware of, right? So first and foremost, selection problems. What that means is if you're having a psychological experiment or study, you have to get participants, right? And so when you ask for participants, right? So let's say I send out on a message board, hey, I need 15 students from my local university to come be guards. I will pay you $15 an hour for 4 hours or 2 hours a day to do this, right? So first of all, when you put guard in there, you're selecting for people who want to embody that type of behavior, right? That guard behavior. So that's a selection issue. You're pre-selecting not from a random population, but from a population of individuals that want to embody this, right? And so there was a secondary study that was done at Western Kentucky University. They found that those who responded to the prison experiment advertisement scored significantly higher on measures of aggressiveness, authoritarianism, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and social dominance, and significantly lower on dispositional empathy and altruism compared to the generic study. Wow. So selection problems, right? Next, there's plenty of evidence from the Stanford prison study that individuals actually were caring and were kind, and that some people actually exaggerated their behavior because they were told that they needed to exaggerate their behavior. And so it's not as clear as day that these individuals went in there and acted really bad, because there was plenty that were like, no, I'm not going to be like that. I'm actually going to be a friend. And so these counterbalances, you only hear about the negative, but all the positive stuff you don't hear about. So those are two major flaws in that study. And so a lot of this has been utilized to say that, people who get into positions of power, such as CEOs and politicians, are just corrupt because they're going to manifest that corrupt behavior when they get into that system of power. And, there's a few other studies that he looks at that basically show that people who are more likely to cheat on tests and exams are also more likely to go into public arena, right? To go work for the government and government careers. But again, that raises more questions on why somebody would do that, right? And there's a way to think about this from like a co-evolutionary standpoint. And if you've never read into coevolutionary theory, I would suggest looking at Luhmann's work on coevolution. A lot of good stuff can be brought out by this. And basically what it says is that you have multiple systems that are happening at the same time. And those systems don't really talk, but they have to evolve together. And so when something in the economy changes, something in the political system changes, something in the legal system changes, and so on and so forth, and they all co-evolve. You don't just get evolution in one arena and the rest of them are static. They co-evolve throughout this time period. And so if we think about this coevolution, if you have the property that those who enter the government are corrupt, then those who enter the government are corrupt. That is reflexive, or reflexivity, right? And so parsing out that cultural from the outcome is very difficult. And if you look at one population, you might find that result. And then you look at another population, you might find a completely different result, which tells you that, you know what? This is something that's cultural. It's not something that's innate to human behavior. And they've done this study. So the study that they looked at was in India. They've done this study in parts of Europe, especially in like the lower corrupt areas, such as like Sweden. No. In fact, those people scored higher on the incorruptible tests than their counterparts who went into private. And this is something you can look at in America. It's actually kind of a split down the middle. Corrupt people go into business and corrupt people go into government kind of thing. There's not any preference for, and that's because of the political and economic alignment in America is different than it is in Europe. So ultimately, that whole thesis breaks down because it doesn't actually answer the question, because it just pushes it backwards. Instead of talking about innate human behavior, something that we can actually learn from, it motivates it and just straight up lays it down at the feet of culture, which doesn't answer the question. But on the next episode, we're going to be getting into the evolution of power. And I think that is going to be one of the most interesting videos. It might actually be a 2-part video because there's so much information that's got to be broken into there. And this video is already too long. Anyway, if you're still there, like, share, subscribe. Let me know how we're doing. Haven't talked to any of y'all in a while. Have a good one.